Hello, 10A and 10B. I hope every one of you students are doing well and that each and every one of you are continuing to focus as closely as possible on your studies. Today we will be looking at some of the major Greek philosophers. Obviously there were more than just these few that we are covering, but it would take a much longer and more thorough class to cover all of them. And we just need to think about the major philosophers at this point. We're going to begin with Pythagoras. He lived around 570 BC to 490 BC, so he actually had quite a long life, 80 years. Now it appears that the major claim to his fame as a mathematician is not correct. You may have heard of Pythagorean mathematics and formulas, but most historians, and we'll get more into this, believe that that may not be correct. It seems that Pythagoras taught that the soul was immortal, eternal, and that after death it went on to live again in different bodies of different people. So definitely has a reincarnation type of understanding. What does it mean to be reincarnated? Well, so karnos, or carnal, is the Greek word, koinai Greek word for flesh. And there are several different words for flesh in Greek, and this is one of them. And so if you are to be reincarnated, that means to be put into the flesh once again. So your soul would be a nebulous, immaterial type of spirit, and you would enter into a different flesh. There is a strong element of religious teaching in his doctrine, and he appears to have worked on metaphysical theories relating to other aspects of both life and death and life after death. So he was not purely or distinctly a mathematician. And it should be noted that many of these philosophers dealt with various subjects. One of the hallmarks of early philosophers, even up until, let's say, about the medieval period, was that they dealt with a range of different topics. They could be fluent in areas of history, what we understand as philosophy, as well as science. And that was because the amount of knowledge that was in circulation at the time was actually not as much as there is now, and so there was not the need to specialize due to the incredible volume of information. So he worked in several different areas, as did many of them. Now, much of, as I've been indicating, much of what we know of Pythagoras is unreliable, since it is at the earliest written 150 years after his death. So what is in existence as far as writings or as far as communication of his main beliefs or core values is suspect. Now, in oral societies, which Greece was emerging from being at this time, still 570 BC, there is a much higher credibility and level of credibility in an oral society in that time. And in oral societies, even in our own time, there reliability is very, very high because you depend on the spoken word for absolute truth and knowledge. So in the eyes of a contemporary society, having that historical distance may not be as a complex or big issue for them as it is for us. Now, some authors have, again, complained about how the various traditions and ideas grew up around him, but since we lack any other outside knowledge, it is really nearly virtually impossible to separate the myth from the reality. And so it is definitely in my mind and in other historians and philosophers' mind, the better bet to kind of fall on the we'll give it credit and the benefit of the doubt rather than throwing out the entire lot or the entire amount of what he said. Socrates, not Socrates, Socrates. Once you understand Greek language and how to pronounce the letters, you definitely know it's Socrates. 469 BC through 399 BC. And Socrates lived through the Peloponnesian War, having been born in the period after the Persian Wars. And he was actually the tent mate of a very famous and well-known Peloponnesian fighter and politician in Athens named Alcibiades. Now, Socrates did not leave any writings, and again, no writings, and all we have are what is contained in the Platonic writings, or the writings from Plato. Now, it is likely that these reflect some of his actual teachings and what he felt. And we'll talk about Plato's dialogues in a minute, but whatever he did write has been lost to history. Now, again, we're still talking about a society that is probably 75% dependent upon oral transmission, communication, and only about 25% on the written word. So it is still safe to presume that the majority of what he taught was preserved through oral tradition or through oral communication, and thus whatever Plato learned about him, either directly or indirectly, was accurate. Now, Socrates' main aim was to get people to think for themselves. He would go around and ask questions which required the student or the person to respond to him and to think through information. Basically, he is the father of critical thinking. He is also the model on which Western education is built. The student is not to learn through merely listening, but through interaction and by making the learning process their own responsibility. I say merely because in some settings like colleges, universities, and some other contexts, listening to a lecture is the primary form of delivery. In high schools and other types of schools, it seems that there's a bit more interaction with materials, but when you get to college, it's definitely lecture. However, a lot of professors will use and teachers will use the Socratic method in asking their students questions throughout the lecture to get them to engage in a thinking process and to get the student to develop those ideas and concepts on their own. And it's very important to do. Plato, 429 through 347 BC. So he was born about the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, which we'll study about later. But he obviously was not old enough to participate. He was probably just coming into good maturity about the end of the war. Now, Plato is responsible for writing a good majority of what we know as Greek philosophy. He wrote his books in the style of conversations written down, often with other dead or living philosophers participating in a conversation. So these were the dialogues, and he wrote all of his books in the form of dialogues. So you may have 3 or 4 people, with Plato being one of them, who is represented. He might set his book at the end of a meal, or they're walking in a field, and they begin to ask questions to each other, and they begin to explain their own positions, and then Plato will explain his position and explain why it is the better position or why somebody else has more merit. And so the Platonic dialogues are interesting reading if you're not so much into philosophy. You may get a little bored, you might get a little lost, because you're trying to keep track of these, basically this transcript of a conversation. Now, I say that some of them were dead. As we know, Socrates was coming to the end of his life. So how much interaction he had with Plato and how much Plato was able to really take from him, we're not 100% sure, but the ability for him to weave in his ideas and his thoughts on these subjects is very important. Now, his central idea of Plato's is that the world appears to our senses is in some way defective and filled with error. But there is a more real and perfect realm populated by entities called forms or ideas that are eternal, changeless, and in some sense represent a plan or perfect representation for everything. So, for example, if you saw a dog, there is, in Plato's thinking, a perfect dog in what you would consider heaven. And every dog on earth is built on and designed around that perfect scheme. There's a perfect cat, bird, fish, and all of this. There's a perfect human and a perfect person in heaven, and that idea is transferred to mortals, to people. And we understand that a dog with 3 legs is not right. You know, we know as a little kid, and we pointed out to Mom, hey, Mom, there is a dog with 3 legs. You know, what happened to his 4th leg? Well, how do we know innately that a 3-legged dog is imperfect or incorrect rather than a 4-legged dog? So Plato's idea is that we all begin in the same perfect place, and that when we come to earth, we come with a basic knowledge of all of what a perfect thing should be. We know what a perfect flower should look like, smell like, and feel like. And when we pick up imperfect flowers and smell imperfect flowers, we know they are imperfect because we have already had some spiritual interaction with that perfection. And we retain that spiritual knowledge in our lives. So he said, now in a very complex way, and I need to keep this short, but he also said that this is why he believed that the gods existed but could not affect what happens here on earth, because the gods could not come to a realm of imperfection, that the realm of perfection and the realm of imperfection were eternally, physically, and dynamically separated, meaning that there was no way for the perfect to break a type of dimensional barrier into the imperfect, and the imperfect had no way to cross that same dimensional barrier into the perfect. And so while they may exist, they cannot have a type of interaction with us. And this actually becomes quite an interesting problem in the future, and we'll talk about it later. Going on to one of our last ones, or our last one, is Aristotle. Aristotle lived in 384 to 322 BC. Now, Aristotle studied his teacher's lessons very carefully, and his teacher was no one else or none less than Plato. And he in many ways reflected his teacher's core ideas and method of writing. Aristotle did the dialogues as well. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. When Alexander was a small boy, we definitely know that he was a teacher of Alexander when he was 13. We're really not sure what impact Aristotle had on Alexander's worldview and his personality. Likely it proved fairly impactful, since 13 years old is a very impressionable period for boys, both mentally and physically. We will look more at major beliefs and tenets next week, but it's important to know that these philosophers and ideas influenced Western thought, particularly in the 1750s and beyond, specifically in a movement that has been called the Enlightenment. Also promoted ideas that were thought to be these philosophers promoted a lot of ideas that were very controversial for their time and setting. And so Socrates was killed. The city of Athens, the representative body, voted to put him to death, and he had to drink, I believe it was hemlock. Also, Plato was walking a very thin line by questioning the reality or the nature of the gods and their ability to interact with humans. Again, this was a very religious time, and so to suggest that they couldn't interact with people or have an effect on people's lives was tantamount to calling yourself an atheist at that time. And Aristotle, again, appears to have, we're not exactly sure what kind of impact he had on Alexander the Great, but to judge by Alexander's later example, whatever influence he did exert appears to have worn off or not been very great at all. Thank you.